This is the first of two lessons on Daniel, who was a young man when he was taken into exile in Babylon with the people of Judah before the group that would include Ezekiel. Many people have tried to push the date of writing past the events predicted out of nothing but bias against divine inspiration, because the prophecies concerning historical events are so accurate and detailed. Jesus referred to Daniel specifically, and also Ezekiel did, of course, as well, as we saw in the last lesson. So we'll begin here, of course, with chapter 1. We'll go to about halfway through the book. There is only 12 chapters, but they're very meaty, so it will take 2 lessons. The book of Daniel begins with historical context, that being his deportation to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. But the king knew the value of people of character and intelligence, so he had his official search for standouts among the captives. These were to be treated well, fed from the king's table, and educated in the literature and language of Babylon. Some today would consider accepting such an offer an act of betrayal or treason, but this is short-sighted. Most rebellions require infiltrators in high places anyway. But in this case, it was God's long-range plan to bring a remnant back from exile and to inform his people of what to expect in the future. So always seek God's will if you find yourself or am tempted to bash someone else in a similar situation, because you don't know what God's plans are. It turns out that Daniel and 3 of his friends were among the chosen, and all of them were given Babylonian names. And it's curious that tradition has always referred to Daniel by his Hebrew name, while his friends are called by their Babylonian names. Now, in verse 8 here, in chapter 1, it says that Daniel didn't want to be defiled by the king's food, so he asked to be fed a vegetarian diet. Some take this as a divine mandate for vegetarianism, but it's nothing of the sort. It was a choice to eat only that which was permitted by the law of Moses in a foreign land where the meat did not qualify. The law allowed and even presumed the eating of clean meats, and because of this brave stance, God blessed Daniel and his friends with great knowledge and skill, but Daniel was also given prophetic insight. So if we go down to verse 18, we see that after the 3-year training period, these 4 people impressed the king more than all the others, and Daniel himself would live through the entire span of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, as shown in verse 21. So that's just a brief overview of his life. And in chapter 2, we begin with the king's experiences of many strange dreams. But he doesn't remember a particular one, and he demands that his astrologers tell him both the dream and its meaning, which should sound familiar from the days of Joseph in Egypt. So this king demands that his astrologers tell him both the dream and the meaning, but after they become exasperated with the threat of a horrible death because they have no real psychic ability, let that be a lesson to astrologers today, we see here in verse 10 that they and all the other wise men, including Daniel and his friends, were to be rounded up and executed. But Daniel was granted time to prevent the executions, so he had his friends all pray for God's mercy and interpretation. And upon receiving it, we see in verse 19 that Daniel praises God, another thing we Christians need to remember when we do get answers to prayer. And in verse 25, Daniel informs the official that he is ready to appear before the king with the answers, and he begins by crediting God with this insight, rather than taking credit for himself, which is yet another reminder for us Christians. So now let's go to verse 31. And the dream itself was of the statue, hopefully you see here, made of metals from head to toe in decreasing order of value. The interpretation begins in verse 37, and it extends through verse 45. It's a prophecy of 4 world empires, beginning with King Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold. The next to come, the silver part, would be less powerful, which turned out to be that of Medo-Persia. After that would come the bronze part, representing the even less powerful Grecian Empire, followed by the iron legs representing the least powerful Roman Empire. The feet of a mixture of iron and clay are not a fifth empire, but a description of the fourth in its final stages. It will become weak because it will attempt to force together people groups who aren't compatible. So it may start out strong, but it will become weak. That's the symbol of the statue. Some take the phrase mingling with the seed of men as meaning hybrid humans or Nephilim. But we should note first of all that the word for men here means common, ordinary people, as opposed to rulers or elites. That's the contrast. And the word for mingling means trading or associating. So it seems the interpretation with the best support is that this represents a mixture of incompatible cultures, governments, and economies brought about by Rome's wide-ranging conquest. The present European Union is a good example. It was forced into a quote-unquote union that is never really unified, except in the power class, who keeps trying to force it on unwilling populations. We also see the desperate attempt to break resistance to it by injecting Middle Easterners in large numbers, but this too is failing. This is an attempt to mix cultures, and that's why this kingdom is weak. Many have also tried to put significance into the fact that the two legs are split, as if there's the representing the eastern-western split of the Roman Empire and the Roman Church. And they also say the same about the 10 toes, that this must represent the 10 kingdoms. But then we must ask why a similar argument is not made for the statue's 2 arms. And also the thighs, which we consider part of the legs, but the representation here considers part of the torso. And those are split in 2 as well, but nobody bats an eye at that. So the passage gives no indication that either the number of arms and legs or the number of toes has any significance here. And last but not least, the phrase "in the days of those kings" is given for this divinely cut stone, which breaks the feet and represents the everlasting kingdom of the Messiah, and will permanently destroy the Roman Empire in the end times. So let's keep the symbolism where it is and where it gives it to us. There will be more overlapping symbols later, but for now, there is no significance given, and not in any of the other symbols to come, no significance to the splitting of East and West. But there will be significance in 10 kingdoms, because the 10 toes will be later represented by 10 horns. Now when the king, if we see down here in verse 40, when the king realized that Daniel had rightly described and interpreted the dream, he bowed to him and ordered people to make sacrifices to him. But we know he wasn't being made a god, because the king gave honor to Daniel's God as the one above all others. So this was just how you honored someone in that time. Now someone will take this argument and say this is why we know Jesus wasn't really God, but that's a different context, and I've gone over that in the New Testament studies. So, because absolutely people did consider Jesus God. Anyway, Daniel is not being considered a god here, but he's being greatly honored, and he was elevated to a very high government position, to which he then hired his friends as assistants. But as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. And as we'll see next in the next slide, we're about to get into the fiery furnace issue in chapter 3. Now, this is just Daniel's friends, not Daniel himself. A lot of people forget about that. So we see how short-lived such honors can be, and the king decides to build a giant statue that everyone would be obligated to worship on pain of death by being thrown into a furnace. Of course, the formerly demoted astrologers saw the opportunity to be rid of these Hebrew upstarts. So we see in verse 8 that they eagerly exposed Daniel's friends as lawbreakers who refused to worship the statue. Evidently, Daniel was out of town or something, and there's no mention of him here, but only his friends. So the king, who seemed to have the memory and loyalty of a goldfish, has them arrested and gives them one last chance to comply. But as we see in verse 16, they issue a challenge of their own in response. They will gladly be thrown into the furnace, where either they'll die or they'll be miraculously delivered, but either way they won't worship the statue. So the king flies into a blind rage and has the fire stoked to a much higher temperature than normal, and then he has his strongest soldiers throw the the three in, but the only people killed were the soldiers. In verse 24, the king sees 4 people in the fire, all walking around unharmed and unbound, and the 4th appears to be supernatural or divine. So the king calls them to come out of the furnace, though the supernatural being doesn't come with them. And the 3 that come out are found to be completely unharmed by the fire, not even the smell of smoke on their clothes. So in verse 28, the king comes to his senses and praises the God who protected them. Further, he orders all of Babylon to honor their God. Does anyone think these are still traitors? Remember what we said earlier about people thinking that if you cooperate with your captors that you are a traitor or a sellout? Now how's that working? It's working out for the people of Israel and God's long-range plans. Because remember also from previous studies that this deportation was God's will as punishment for Israel. So for them to take any kindness was actually a smart move. So we have to always consider context. Now if we go to chapter 4, it shows the context of the edict from the king about all this, though the first 3 verses really belong to the end of chapter 3, and that's how the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, has it. What follows is a completely separate incident, another dream, as we can see here in verse 4. This time he tells the astrologers the dream, the king does, but they still can't interpret it. So once again, it's Daniel to the rescue, and it has to do with what we see, hopefully, in this picture here. It starts out as, in verse 11, about a huge tree, which in verse 13 is ordered to be chopped down, but its taproot left in the ground, where it would be covered in dew and left with the animals. And then in verse 16, it turns to what starts giving the actual meaning by saying that his mind would be turned into that of an animal for 7 years to teach him that God has authority over human kingdoms. But the interpretation, the full interpretation of it starts in verse 19, and it shows just how harsh the lesson will be. And it disturbs Daniel to the point where he's very reluctant to give it. So after explaining that the tree represents the king, in verse 25, Daniel tells him that King Nebuchadnezzar, will be stricken with the mind of an animal and driven from human contact, where he'll eat grass with the animals and live outside for the allotted 7 years. But like the preserved taproot, the king would get his mind and kingdom back after that time, because he would finally understand that everything he is and has is only by God's decree and mercy. Notice in verse 27, Daniel pleads with the king to stop sinning so this doesn't happen, because the king had been turning a blind eye to the plight of the poor, and that was one of the reasons for this warning. But it doesn't actually happen until a year later, and that's when the 7 years actually begin, because the king boasted that everything was due to his own power and skill. As soon as the words left his mouth, it says, a voice from heaven rebuked him, and off he went to his life of madness for 7 years. Now, if we look down in verse 34, he is quoted as saying that his sanity returned as predicted once the 7 years were passed and the kingdom was restored to him. But without any other explanation, the text turns in chapter 5 to the reign of Belshazzar, second in command to someone extra-biblical texts call Nabonidus, or Nabonidus, I'm not sure. This is why Belshazzar would promise shortly to make someone the 3rd ruler of Babylon, because he was the 2nd. Not the 2nd necessarily in order, but the 2nd in command. So check the commentary for more details of names and years passing in all of this. But he's most famous for an expression many don't realize comes from the Bible, the hand writing on the wall. Not handwriting, but the hand writing on the wall. Belshazzar was partying and drunk when he made the grave mistake of having everyone drink wine from the gold and silver cups that had come from the looting of God's temple in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. They even praised their gods of metal, wood, and stone while they drank. So God let them see something they didn't expect to see even in that condition. A lot of times drunks see things, but this is not what they expected. A disembodied hand writing mysterious words on the wall. So the king called for his astrologers and offered great wealth and honor to whoever could explain this, but of course his astrologers were as useless as all the others before them. Yet even today, people consult astrologers and believe they have scientific proof that the stars order their lives. Now, if we look down in 17, at least the queen mother had better memory than a goldfish, and she told them to send for Daniel. When he arrives, he tells Belshazzar to keep his gifts and honors because he'll give the meaning for free. His message was that Belshazzar didn't learn the lesson taught to Nebuchadnezzar that we just learned about it with him being struck with madness for 7 years. And he had no humility or respect for God at all. So if we see down here in verse 25, the words on the wall were written, and they meant that Belshazzar's days were numbered, that his life was not measuring up, and that the kingdom of Babylon was about to be divided up between the Medes and the Persians, as we recall from the vision of the statue, Medo-Persia. Belshazzar was killed that very night and replaced by Darius the Mede, who would later be co-ruled with Cyrus the Persian. Now in chapter 6, it says that Belshazzar appointed Daniel as an advisor, who once again impressed the new, or not Belshazzar, I'm sorry, this is Darius the Mede, kept Daniel as an advisor, who once again impressed the new king. But again, the others were jealous of the honors bestowed upon him, the other high officials. But because he lived such a clean life that they couldn't catch him on corruption charges, they hatched a plot to get him executed because of his God. That same tactic is used often today whenever some pesky, clean-living Christian gets in the way of other people's plans or fun. Now, as we see in verse 6, they advised the king to make a permanent and inflexible law that for the next 30 days, anyone who worships a god or king but him should be thrown into a den of hungry lions. Daniel heard about this and immediately broke the law by praying to God as he always had, because his normal habits were now illegal, which was the plan. And of course, since they knew his habits, the jealous schemers just happened to catch him in the act. So off they went to snitch to the king, who, as we see in verse 14, tries his best to find a legal loophole to get Daniel out of this predicament. But the snitches told him it was no use, so the order was given to throw Daniel to the lions. And this picture, this is a good picture, but it doesn't accurately portray where he was. He was in basically a large hole in the ground. And so he was escorted there, and the king took him along with, escorted him as well, and hoped that God would protect him. And this was no mere hole in the ground, as I mentioned. It was covered with a heavy stone after he was thrown in, and sealed off with the king's and nobles' official seal, much the way the temporary tomb of Jesus would be done. After a sleepless night, the king hurries back to the den in the morning and calls out to Daniel, who, as we can see in verse 21, was unharmed. So he's lifted out of the den, but the king quickly gave another order to throw in the snitches and their families, who were chewed up before they even hit bottom. Then Darius sent out a notice to the whole land that only Daniel's God was to be worshipped. Now, we can't always expect to be rescued for our faithfulness, as we see in Hebrews 11, but we do see that in this case it caused many to turn to the one true God. And of course, people today read their modern cultural norms and sensitivities back into these times, but this was a common thing that people did, and it actually had a good purpose to it. People think, it's terrible for God or anyone else to put children to death. But in those days, children grew up to be avengers of their parents. So that was the human reason for such things. But in God's case, God is the giver of life. He has the right to take it. And we can see better in the New Testament, when a child dies, they go to heaven. So God was actually doing them a favor, most likely, growing up with having evil parents. They would likely have lost their souls as well. So by allowing them to die as children, it was actually an act of mercy. We only see this side of things, and so we misinterpret, and people call God evil. Even many professing Christians are starting to slide into this Gnostic belief that The God of the Old Testament is an evil demiurge who did a bumbling job of creating and has no moral fiber. This is completely untrue. It is a satanic lie. Anyway, people will turn to God as a result of this saving of Daniel, and nobody batted an eye about the families being thrown in. They totally deserve it. The people deserved it, and their children were actually being shown mercy spiritually. And we see in verse, at the end of the chapter, in verse 28, it adds that Daniel lived on through the reign of Darius to that of Cyrus the Persian, as we learned in the first chapter, and so ends the primarily historical section of the book. And now it's back to more detail given in a different way about the vision of the statue. So now we're going to see some overlap. Notice, first of all, in chapter 7, that this vision came during the reign of Belshazzar rather than Cyrus. Also notice that it was given to Daniel rather than to the king, and that the interpretation is given to Daniel by an angel. You might also want to view the chart in the commentary on this passage, which compares the two visions. And this is what Daniel sees as best as people can imagine it. There are 4 beasts, and they all come out of the sea. You notice, I don't know if you can tell the water behind them. They're coming out of the sea, while it's actually under their feet a little bit too, which in the Bible represents Gentile nations. The first beast was something like a winged lion, whose wings were torn off, after which it stood on 2 legs like a human and was given a human's mind. The second was like a bear, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth, and it was told to go out and devour more flesh. The third was like a leopard, having 4 wings on its back and 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. And we see down in verse 7, the 4th beast was not compared to any known animal, that's the one in the back there, but it was fearsome and powerful with 2 rows of iron teeth. It crushed and trampled everyone and everything, and it had 10 horns. But as Daniel watched, a small horn grew up among the 10, and 3 other horns were torn out to make room for it. This little horn had human-like eyes and a boastful mouth. So keep all those things in mind. Because down in verse 9, Daniel sees then the throne of God, and by comparing it to the description in the first chapter of Revelation, we see that this is much like Jesus in his glory before he took on human flesh, as stated in Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Now notice in verse 10 that the scene is a courtroom, and the books opened should be understood in that context. That's all we're told about them, but they're being opened in a court of law, basically. And we'll go down to verse 11, where Daniel sees that the 4th beast was killed and thrown into the fire, which is described also in Revelation 19:20 regarding the future beast or Antichrist. The beast is actually a more accurate name in Revelation. Here, the other beasts were allowed to continue ruling for a time and a season, but then in verse 13, Daniel turns his attention to someone described as human-like who approaches the Ancient One, or the Ancient of Days, by coming with the clouds, a reference to Matthew 24:30 and Revelation 1:7. So both the Father and the Son are described in very similar terms, which shouldn't surprise us if we understand that Jesus has always been God, but also became human at a point in time. And this is kind of a foreshadowing, which of course no one would have guessed during that time or before actually the writings of Paul, who clarified all these things, because he was given the mystery, or really rather secret, of what all this meant. And there are other scriptures that say in the New Testament that the Old Testament prophets didn't understand what they were saying, and they longed to look into these things, as it also did even the angels. So symbols are given long before their fulfillment, which is, as I've said before, the fingerprint of God on the scriptures as divinely inspired. But right now, let's go down to verse 15. Now, before we try to guess the meanings, Daniel is given them, so we can't allegorize what the angel's about to say, especially since the animals are the symbols. So the interpretation of the symbols cannot be considered symbols as well. They might not be as descriptive as we'd like, but they're not symbols. Again, the vision reveals a succession of kingdoms, but Daniel is particularly curious about the 4th one. Notice additional detail in verse 21. the little horn waged war against the holy ones and was defeating them, which of course cannot apply to the church, since in Matthew 16:18, Jesus said that could never happen. The gates of hell would not, Hades actually would not prevail against his church that he would make. That's one of the very, very, very few references Jesus made to a coming church rather than the people he was talking to at the time, the church or congregation of Israel. So those people to come would not be prevailed against, but these holy ones are going to be prevailed against by the little horn. But the Ancient One will prevent their complete annihilation, and the court scene mentioned earlier is for the purpose of judging in their favor, the favor of the holy ones that are being oppressed and defeated. Now in verse 23, the explanation of the fourth kingdom is given. It will conquer and subjugate the whole world, and 10 kings will arise to power within it, followed by an 11th who topples 3 of them. That's the meaning of the horns. And this little horn, as we see starting in verse 25, will blaspheme God and relentlessly persecute anyone who follows him. Then he will, notice, attempt to change lawfully appointed times, which is a likely reference to either the Hebrew sacred calendar or to a doomed effort to thwart the prophecies of God. The phrase a time, times, and half a time throughout Daniel is held by pretty much everyone to mean 3.5 years, and we'll see more about this in chapter 9. But that's the length of the reign of this boastful king, which ends with the heavenly court's decision to remove him from power and banish him forever, and that's what you'll see described in Revelation at the end of the tribulation, beginning of the millennium. Now, before we end our examination of this particular vision of prophecy, notice more references in Revelation throughout this, especially Revelation chapter 17. As the commentary points out for this section, Daniel and Revelation have similar structures. There's an introduction, worldwide judgments, and then a focus on Israel. That's the pattern of both books. So these are some of the many reasons why Revelation is the unsealing of Daniel's end times prophecies, and how we know that the judgments of Revelation span 7 years. This is where we get that. There are too many people who only look at Revelation and say there's nothing about 7 years here. Well, this is where it is. Daniel is very much the root of a lot of what Revelation says, so you have to understand Daniel to understand Revelation. And Daniel says that there will be 7 years, and we'll get more into that when we get to chapter 9. For those who say all of this was fulfilled by the end of the 1st century AD, that is to say preterism, they must appeal to allegory, since these things clearly have not happened. But that's it for part 1, and we'll finish the book in the next lesson.